very much, and thank you to Nisha and Sophia for inviting me. I've been so impressed to be here. I'm sorry I couldn't be here for the whole morning, and I'm sorry I'll have to leave straight after this. There have been sightings of my missing cat about 10 miles away that I have to go and follow up. So I shall be running off, but I've been really impressed so far. And it's really nice as well coming to a conference when you'll probably get more experience of this in due course, but conferences tend to be pretty dull when you're simply listening 10 times over to stuff you already know, which is what happens when they're on your immediate specialism. But when you come to something like this, it's really impressive to see the diversity and range of stuff that people do. So what I want to talk to you about today then, and I don't think it's going to be particularly coherent, we'll worry about that in due course, but I want to talk to you about the idea that humans are and always have been, both on an evolutionary level and on a cultural level, constituted through the tools, the technical implements, the technologies that we use as supports and supplements in the world. And this means as well that gender, there's no such thing as natural gender. Gender is and always has been a technological construct. Where this will bisect with contemporary debates in feminism and consumerism is going to be the extent to which what we're currently seeing is something like a commodification of the production of gender, the mass production of gender stereotypes that are leaving us increasingly disempowered when it comes to creating our own gender identities. Now this might sound really quite counterintuitive. It's so obviously the case nowadays that we're seeing a proliferation of possible gender identities that have certainly not been the case in the recent past, and there's a very good claim to be made that they haven't been the case for a great deal of time over the course of human history, or 180,000 or so years of it. But at the same time, I'll talk you through some suggestions that will show that wherever we see these new productions of gender take place, there's quite often something much more problematic going on in terms of the exercise of power as well. And I'll start you off in that direction. Well, these are just a few of the books that I'll be implicitly referring to throughout. Most notably my own little one, which is hopefully going to get finished at some point over this summer, Artificial Selection, The Digital Age and the Rules of Nature. But I want to start then with these two pictures. One of Jaden Smith, Will Smith's son, and one of Caitlyn Jenner, who's just very publicly had a sex change and is making a reality documentary about this that's being filmed at the moment. And I've given you the header, two of the most grotesque people on the planet. That's obviously a provocation there. What I'd like to suggest is that this grotesqueness has got nothing to do with their gender fluidity and everything to do with the commodified, capitalized way in which that gender fluidity gets presented. So what we have in Will Smith's son, for example, is somebody where we might really legitimately ask questions about how difficult it's going to be for someone in a position of immense privilege and wealth who takes 5,000 selfies of himself every day to walk around in a dress. Is this really going to be meaningful gender invention, or is this simply going to be cynical capitalization? I have to say, I know next to nothing about Caitlyn Jenner, apart from the fact that she's making a reality documentary about herself. That inclines me to think ill of her, but maybe it's a bit harsh to say the most grotesque people on the planet. Maybe put them in the top billion or so. So, what do we mean by that? So I suggested then that any suggestion of grotesqueness here can't fall and won't fall in anything that I say on anything about what is at stake in the question of gender fluidity and gender construction. What I want to kind of hone in on is a much more problematic and ambiguous idea that wherever we're seeing constructions of gender that get somehow taken up and pushed forward by the market, we start to fall into much more problematic areas of what we might call structural perversion. Now, I'll say this structural perversion, I'll differentiate it from what nowadays in psychiatry gets referred to as paraphilias. Paraphilias would refer to any kind of unusual sexual practice, be it bestiality, shoe fetishes, or whatever, homosexuality would once have been classed among them, but not so much anymore. When I talk about perversion here, I'm not talking about perversion in that sense that would say that there's something immoral about any kind of sexual practice. I'm talking rather about structural perversion. And the key thing that I'll make a distinction around here, and we've seen these names mentioned a little bit this morning, we might talk about a kind of a modern, traditional, hysterical subjectivity, where what we want most as human subjects is to achieve some kind of recognition of who we are, acceptance, mutual affirmation, and so on. That's what I'd call hysterical subjectivity, i.e. where you pose yourself as a question to the world and you ask the world to reply back to you, it's okay, you're fine as you are. We'll contrast that with what Slavoj Žižek and Jacques Lacan would call perverse subjectivity, which is really about, and think about Katie Price as the obvious example of this, where somebody gives up on the idea of themselves as being a human subject in search of love and recognition from the rest of the world, and they simply proffer themselves as, or rather not simply, it's never simple, it's always fundamentally ambiguous, but rather than offering yourself up as a subject to the world in search of love and recognition for who you are, you content yourself to become an object of the consumption of others. The term used for that earlier today was jouissance, but we needn't dwell on that too much. But what we find, for example, in someone like Katie Price, is that she'll drag herself through God knows what in the media, simply for the sake of retaining her position as an object of other people's enjoyment, willing to dehumanize herself in all manner of ways. Now, this, I suggest, is going to be deeply bound up with the logic of celebrity culture. It's also going to be bound up with the logic of capitalism and consumerism in particular, where we're all, to a very considerable extent, being asked to perform ourselves in ways that make us enjoyable objects of consumption for everybody else. So, I want to situate all of this, though, in the context of the growing role of consumer capitalism in the construction of gender norms. And what I'll suggest then is that there's going to be this undecidable relationship. We get so many instances where something might look like a really progressive, affirmative construction of gender identities, but equally where we'll flip it round and see actually what looks like it might be affirmative, positive, progressive. Someone like Jaden Smith wearing a dress, for example, we might say is a normalization of sexual fluidity. At the same time, we might flip it round and say, actually, this is a cynical process of marketing and exploitation going along here. Now, where this becomes interesting in terms of the work that I do on the theory of artificial selection is that we find that far from it being French theory, structuralism, post-structuralism, and so on, that came up with these ideas about the social construction of gender. The point where this will all kick off is when the markets, and what we might call technoscience, the scientific industries that work to commercialize, sell sexuality and products that naturalize certain kinds of sexuality, this is where debates over gender in the post-war period will begin. In other words, before theory gets there, before Judith Butler comes along, it's going to be things like nascent fertility industries, nascent cosmetic industries that discover that there is no such thing as natural gender. And rather, natural gender, natural, in wiggle fingers there, is produced by markets. The norms that determine how gender gets manufactured are produced and can be commandeered to the point where we're being sold a product and not simply being empowered in any kind of self-invention here. So, before we go into that in a little bit more depth, the argument at the core here is that humans always have been products not simply of natural selection, but of what we might call artificial selection as well. We can put that at a genetic level. The genes that we've evolved with are very much determined by the fact that for some 3 million years people have been using tools, and those tool-based environments get determine which tools get passed on. But we can also phrase that in terms of cultural evolution. In other words, the hand that writes with a pen is not at all the same as a hand that simply chips away at stuff with a flint 80,000 years ago. The body gets neurologically programmed, conditioned, our muscularity gets conditioned by the kind of tools that we use, the ways that these inherited tools determine our behaviours. They don't just sit on top of an already produced natural human existence, they inscribe our interiority. We may say that there's some genetic basis to this, probably around 40 to 50% of behaviours are genetically linked in some way is the current thinking, but above all we see the way in which different kinds of tool cultures will commandeer bodies, write bodies in different ways, make the experience of things that we take as being so fundamental to human existence, desire, time, attention, and so on. All of these things aren't natural. Desire is not natural. It is always constructed, mediated through technology. And the fact that all of these things are constructed, mediated through technology means that if you're in control of which technologies get produced, then you can become quite easily in control of which genders get produced as well. And what we'll build up to seeing at the end of this then is that we're starting to see a real shift that comes along with the digital age. Particularly in terms of what we're now seeing about algorithmic marketing. Every time you get on your Amazon page, other people also bought this, we can see that as a reinscription of your gender, whatever that gender is, whether it's straight down the line male, female, binaries, or whether you're being produced into having certain kinds of minor gender as well. The key point here is that capitalism finds a way of picking up on things that look emancipatory, liberatory, and actually makes you start to question them. A really good example that we might begin with here is the Torches of Freedom campaign in 1929. In the 1920s in America, it was still regarded as deeply prostitute-like and immoral for women to smoke. It was illegal for women to smoke in public. Why did that change? Because the tobacco industries hired a young man by the name of Edward Bernays, who was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and really developed modern marketing by applying theories of unconscious manipulation to selling stuff. The advertising industry was hired by the tobacco industry to find ways of increasing the sale of tobacco. How did they do that? They started making it okay for women to smoke. So they'll organise all kinds of rallies and presentations. They will very much, if we flip over here, start to present smoking as an affirmative, liberating, pro-feminist thing to do. We see, but we see that the history that starts off as something liberating becomes increasingly cynical. An ancient prejudice has been removed in the first advert that we've got here. In other words, this is really about the tobacco industry facilitating, advocating women's rights. Not much later, we've got exactly the same image and saying, women, if you're fat, try smoking. So the discourse of liberation gets taken over and turned into one of the production of deleterious gender norms. And we can see that that will continue well up into the 1990s, where smoking is going to get presented as, on one hand, promoting admirable female qualities like being sassy and confident and so on, but equally, quite clearly, also participating in the production of gender norms there too. Now, we might take some more revealing examples here. The thing about smoking is that we might find it difficult to say, well, how's that going to be linked to the notion of nature and the natural states of gender? So let's take an alternative example, which will be the role of what we might call industrial endocrine production. In other words, these industries that start off in the post-war era producing synthetic estrogen, testosterone, birth control pills, and how these start to participate in the production of what we might understand as natural sex. So the key, and we see that this industry even begins by inventing the term gender a couple of years before people like Simone de Beauvoir, come up with it. We can see that the evidence for pretty dodgy industry, the colonial roots of the fact that birth control pills were tested on people unknowingly in Puerto Rico in the 1950s. But we can see, once we come up with something like the commercial release of Viagra as well, here we can see that we're being sold prosthetic supplements. If you're a man who's impotent, somehow lacking in nature, here we can take some artificial supplements that will constitute your nature for you. Likewise, if you're a woman who is menopausal, we can liberate you from the effects of aging and restitute some kind of earlier, purer female nature that doesn't suffer from this ailment. So technology then will start to envisage itself as producing nature. Actually, we can make a claim that the whole of the history of technology has been about producing nature, but we won't worry about that for the time being. Now, we mentioned the pharmaceutical industry, but I'll give you a slightly different connotation of pharmaceuticals here. We take the philosophical concept of the pharmakon. Pharmakon in ancient Greek is a term that refers both to cure and poison. So in other words, it's the cure, there is also a poison, and we'll start to see that this is also how we can envisage the effects of technology. So on one hand, Viagra will be presented as a cure for impotence, but at the same time, why are we impotent nowadays? Some of it are people just being born that way. A lot of it is due to the pressures of the contemporary non-work-life balance, the stressfulness of jobs, the fact that none of us are getting enough sleep because we're all too busy checking our phones, the fact that so many people are addicted to pornography in ways that have really fundamentally messed up with the reward system of the brain, what we call the dopamine system. So in other words, Viagra might look like a cure, but actually in prescribing this cure for all manner of socially caused ills, it's becoming part of the problem. It's legitimating a deleterious series of cultural conditions by which we're all being rendered impotent. We can make the same point about the pill here. The birth control pill might very much look like it's liberating women from undesired pregnancy. At the same time, the argument has been put forward that, well, actually, the pill is an archetypal way of regulating the positioning, the activities of women in space and time. You can make sure that they do action X, take a pill every single morning. You can make sure that men don't have to bear the consequences of their unruly behaviours. And we've got a brilliant example that comes from a fantastic little book by Beatriz Preciado called Testo Junkie, where she will compare the pill case to, this is famously a picture of the panopticon prison system designed in the 19th century and criticised by Michel Foucault. And what we've got with the panopticon is that all you need to control all the inmates' behaviour, you've got all the inmates in these little cells around the outside that can all be seen by one guarder who doesn't even need to be standing in the tower if you put the lights on correctly. You can dominate the way that these people behave, you can regulate their behaviours with a minimal degree of effort. And likewise, we might make this point about taking the pill. Well, it's actually a very good way of coding people's behaviours, but making them code their own behaviours in a way that can look quite liberatory. We could take all manner of these instances of what we might call pharmacology then with regard to technology. Technologies that seem to liberate us on one hand, but actually can really be doing quite a bit of toxic damage on the other. Pornography looks like a liberation of rigid British people, actually messes up the dopamine system, is producing real issues with sexually aggressive young boys who relate more to mimicked behaviours than to actual intimacy. Likewise, we might talk about similarly problematic use of reproductive biotechnologies, where on one hand look great because they allow gay families to have children. On the other hand, we've got real issues that you may remember from earlier this year or last year. The woman in the Philippines who'd kept hold of a Down syndrome baby that parents in Australia even had rejected. We start getting into really complex debates about turning women into commodified baby factories where they'll take money to supply babies to the demands of the market. So we've got this idea then of technology is pharmacological. On one hand, it would seem to be liberatory, breaking down discourses of patriarchy, empowering people to generate new kinds of fluid sexual identities. But equally, we run into serious problems once we start to think about the ease with which the possibilities of self-production of gender can be very easily co-opted and taken over by the markets. Now, one of the main forms of concern here, particularly from the standpoint of gender, is going to be this term generated by Beatriz Preciado, and what she'll call pharmacopornographic capitalism, where capitalism nowadays, and she'll say that this is the fundamental logic of consumerism, is going to be about the production of enjoyment. Whether it's TV adverts that tell you that Diet Coke is all about drinking orgasms, and you only need to look at the adverts to see that that's the claim being made, whether it's all this rubbish about